We are going to have this. It's only going to be a half hour, so it's very cogent and quick, and I want lots of participation. I want you to start lining up with your questions right now, because I'm going to go right to you. And I only have one opening question. It's sort of what they call in diplomatic journalism a tour d'horizon. And I want you to tour the horizon. We in America are of the Americas. We in the United States, I should say properly, are of the Americas, but we're not so much aware of the Americas. And that's a count against us. As president of a country that's located roughly between North and South, I want you to take a couple of minutes and look north and look south in the Western Hemisphere and tell us what you see.
Thank you, Chris. I think that perception regarding the United States and Latin America, I think it has changed in the last years. Basically, the U.S. have been very involved in strengthening the democracy around Latin America. If we go back 10 or 15 years, Latin America was run basically by dictatorship, and now we have full democracy in South America. A lot of political reforms inside our countries, giving a lot of strength to the civil society. In the case of Colombia, only until 1991 we elect the mayors. Before they were appointed by the governors, and the governors were appointed by the president. Now it's a direct democracy, electing the mayors, the closest official government in a political system. We elect the governors 2 years after. So I think that if you see Latin America today, it's a complete different scenario of what happened 10 or 15 years ago. And I think also there's a big difference with the perception regarding the United States. Now the United States is more committed in Latin America. We are working for the free trade agreement that should be signed by the end of 2005, the whole integration, commercial integration in our continent. In the case of Colombia, I think the perception of the United States is completely different. Before we were pointed out as, in the case of my country, as a producing country of drugs. Now the U.S. is really involved with Colombia, fighting hand by hand against narco-terrorism. I think that for the first time, the perception of the United States of what happened in Colombia and regarding the drug problem is completely different. Only until the 9th of September, the U.S. really realized what was happening in the case of Colombia. 10 years ago, narco-traffickers blew up an airplane in our country, but it wasn't big news. In the last 9 months of my tenure as mayor of Bogota, I had in the city of Bogota, that it's at that time it was a 5 million population city, we had 130 narco-terrorist attacks. A blowing up of an airplane, killing of the journalists, police, militaries, civil servants, presidential candidates. I had to bury 3 presidential candidates in 9 months. And now the U.S. is really committed, giving us the support with the help of the world to fight a common problem that is narco-trafficking. So now, in the case of Colombia, Colombia is also a national security country for the United States, not only because of what's happening with drugs, but also because we are a large supplier of oil also for the United States. Venezuela is a strategic country for the United States, is the second largest oil seller to the United States. So I think that there's a big difference. And now I think with the integration, with the free trade agreement area in 2005, the whole scenario will be different in our continent.
Look south, if you will, to the old, we used to call them in grade school, the ABC countries of Chile and Argentina and Brazil. How are they all doing? They're all into democracy now. Is it going to last?
Yes, definitely. I think they're going to last. Even if you see Brazil, okay, we are not growing at the same rate that we used to grow in some years ago. But I think Chile is back on the track. It's a country that is growing 2 or 3 times what it's Latin America growing. The same thing is happening with Colombia. We know Argentina has big problems, but I think they're going to solve it. I think that they need to take tough decisions, that it reforms. Sometimes the problem that is happening in Latin America is that the presidents or the political leaders, they are afraid of taking decisions that will bring them down in the polls. And I think that if you're elected as president of a country, I don't think you're not elected to be high in the polls. You're elected to take decisions, sometimes are very tough decisions, but at the end the benefits will go for the people. And it's the case, for example, in Colombia. If you see Colombia, when I took office in 1998, Colombia and Argentina were on the same track. And now we're in two different tracks. Colombia is growing double or triple of Latin America. Fiscal deficit is controlled. Inflation is controlled. Low interest rates for the loans. We agree on an agreement with the International Monetary Fund, and we took the right decisions of reforms inside the country, and now the Colombia is back on the track, growing 2.5%, 3% this year. Is not as good as we want, but it's the triple of Latin America. What happened, for example, in Argentina, and I think is that they don't took the right decision at the right moment, because they thought that taking this decision will bring, you wouldn't have the popular support, and I think that at the end, that's what is benefiting the country, and that's what happened in Colombia. And now the country is back on the right track, and I think that we will be growing 3-4% in the next year. And if we solve our internal conflict, we should be growing at rates of 6 or 7%, creating employment, better quality of life for our people.
Now to my favorite topic in the United States. And looking north from Latin America, from South America, is the United States still despised?
Still
unpopular?
No. I think that in the case, I talk also for Colombia, for my country. Now the U.S. is helping us in what we promote called Plan Colombia. It's a $1.3 billion support from the United States. It's a $7.5 billion plan for the next 3 years, concentrated on how can we fight drugs, but at the same time develop alternative development and better quality of life for our people. Now the U.S. is giving us support, not only for the military side, to go and attack narco-trafficking, but for the first time in the history of our relation, you have social investment. So I think that now Plan Colombia, for example, the feeling of our people in Colombia is not, this is an imposition of the United States for the country. Now we are partners in this fight. And I think that's the perception also that you could see around Latin America, that now we see the United States as partners in many things, instead of being having imposition of the United States in many issues. And I think now we're partners.
And how long has that been the case?
I think in the last maybe eight years, I think things are starting to change.
Let's take the first question. Go ahead.
I'm Boria Majumdar. I'm a DPhil student in history at Oxford University. You mentioned narco-traffickers blew up a plane 10 years ago and it made no news. Post-September 11, everything's changed. So I was wondering, when we call September 11 the greatest tragedy of our times, don't you think it's an eye-opener that has also given us perhaps the best opportunity to go ahead with global integration, which President Clinton was talking about? I mean, now the US is aware of the problems, and I mean, in this newly changed scenario where your problems can be addressed, at least the biggest world power knows of it, how do you see your country and the other developing countries? I mean, what's their role? And do you see this as perhaps the best ever opportunity to go ahead with global integration?
I think so. I think so. First of all, because we need to fight a common enemy, that in this case is narco-trafficking. In the case of Colombia, narco-trafficking is the one that is financing the violence in my country. Narco-trafficking finance the guerrillas. Narco-trafficking finance the paramilitaries. Narco-traffickers finance common delinquency. And you start to see the ties all around the world. Only 1 year and a half, we captured 3 members of the IRA movement in Colombia that were training members of the guerrilla. Now they're in the Colombian justice. And
do you think that was directed from above? Did that come from Adams and his crowd, or was this freelancing?
I don't know, but we have information that they were not the only ones that have been in Colombia training members of the FARC. So that's why I think that we need, and that's what we're telling the world, that the theory of co-responsibility. Okay, we know that we produce drugs in Colombia, But who's consuming drugs? The
Did
U.S.
Did you see
the
Traffic?
US.
Did you see the movie Traffic?
Yes, yes.
Is it, that should have pointed the finger back to us. What about the rich girl who's the daughter of the guy in charge of who's the drug czar? Michael Douglas. And he finds out his daughter's got all the paraphernalia on top of the refrigerator or whatever. No, it's in the bathroom.
That's what sometimes it's happening, and what we're trying to share with the United States. They need to do more in the demand side. Because maybe in Colombia, one of these days, we're going to finish the business in Colombia. But if you have the demand in the United States, someone is going to sell to the drugs to the United States. And that's why we're calling not only the U.S. Because I've said, for example, Chris, that people don't realize that you cannot have cocaine without a coca plant. It's impossible. Or you cannot have heroin without the poppy plant. But at the same time, you cannot produce drugs without ether or acetone or permanganatum. All the chemical precursors are sold to Colombia basically from Europe, and they don't have any control. And people don't realize the damage even that drug is doing to the environment. So that's something that we try to share with the Europeans. Look, every year, if somebody asks which is the worst damage caused to the environment in the world, I think the Exxon Valdez is one of the things that come first to our memory. We have in Colombia every year between
that was also a substance abuse case, too.
That's right, but
the guy was drunk.
But you have in Colombia every year 2 or 3 Exxon Valdez because all the chemical precursors that are thrown to the rivers, and these rivers go to basically to the rainforest. And you have to be aware that the Amazon basin produces 60% of the oxygen of the world. And now the problem of the contamination of the environment, the Amazon and the rainforest, you have to be aware of that. And that's why we're calling the international community, help us. We have destroyed in the last decade in Colombia, 1 million hectares of rainforest. So one of the alternative development programs that we're promoting is reforestation, so that Europe could have oxygen and the world could have oxygen. And that's why we're asking the world, why don't we unite our efforts to fight this common enemy that now is the one that is financing violence around the world. The drug business, Chris, is the first business in the world. They said the figures is a $500 billion business. And that money is not in the peasants of Colombia, it's not in my country, maybe it's in the United States, maybe it's in the European banks. So that's why we need to unite to fight this common enemy that is narco-terrorism.
It's like the two snows, the snow of cocaine.
Yes.
You're pointing to the ecological damage done to the Amazon. Does that explain why we don't have snow in America anymore? I mean,
Could be. Why not?
I grew up in the snow, shoveling the snow and putting chains on my car. In the East Coast, now there's no more snow.
The damage that is done to the environment. Colombia, only to give you a figure, Colombia is the second largest country with biodiversity in the world.
Yeah.
So here, many of professors have been in Colombia investigating new species, plants.
I'm getting in the hardball here. Have you gotten any? Have you gotten any of the money from all this Starbucks? I swear, in Washington, there's a Starbucks on every corner. We're all caffeined up to the head. We're all hyper. We're all flying high on caffeine.
I'm going to give you one figure. What's the price of a coffee cup in the United States in Starbucks?
It's about $3.
You know how much money stays in Colombian peasants? 1 cent.
Who's getting it?
I think you have the question.
It's all the milk. It's the milk product, the foam.
Yeah, I think you have the question.
The cows are getting the money. Next question.
Hello, my name is David Adesnik. I study international relations at Oxford. Colombia, Mr. President, is remarkable among Latin American nations for the respect which the military has historically had for civilian government that, as you well know, and perhaps for the audience, almost for 100 years, with a brief exception in the 1950s, there have been civilian presidents. Until recently, Venezuela was also considered remarkable for its tradition of civilian predominance over the military. And what I found especially disturbing was that even though President Clinton set a very strong precedent of standing up to military coups in Latin America, we essentially saw the Bush administration give almost immediate approval to an attempted coup in Venezuela. And at the same time, we're also seeing that the Bush administration is quickly backing away from its commitment to democratize Afghanistan. And I'm wondering, how connected do you see these events as being? Do you believe the United States can pursue democracy promotion in one region and not another? And how will you convince George W. Bush that he really must commit himself universally to promoting democracy?
That same question was asked in the Oval Office, I remember, with one of our colleagues of Greece. I don't think that the United States was involved in what happened in Venezuela. Really, my perception of what is happening with the United States, and in the case of the Bush administration, they are very committed in supporting democracy, promoting democracy in Latin America. Even for the first time, that's what I was saying before, in the case of Colombia, of the $1.3 billion in aid, Colombia, I think now is the second or the third largest recipient of aid from the United States. For the first time, we have money not only to fight drugs, but also for social investment, strength of democracy, protection of human rights. Of those $1.3 billion that the U.S. is giving us in the next 3 years, between $250 to $300 million are for these things. One of them is to strengthen democracy, justice, and human rights. And I think that's our perception, our feeling of what is happening with the United States, and that's what we feel, and in which we are working very close with Washington. I think that he is very committed, President Bush as was President Clinton, in strengthening democracy all around Latin America.
Next question.
Hi, I'm Murray McCutcheon, studying physics at Oxford. President Pastrana, I have a question about relating the specific issues of, or abstracting from the specific issues of Colombia to more generalities that we can apply to other countries around the world which face problems and conflict within borders. And I'm wondering if there are some general lessons which you have learned from dealing with problems within Colombia that one might apply to Spain or to Northern Ireland or to Indonesia, or problems within other countries.
Yes, I think sometimes what happened in Colombia is that sometimes reading the newspapers or hearing the TV or radio stations around the world, they talk about Colombia that we're having a civil war inside Colombia, and that's not true. In Colombia, only 1% of the population support the guerrilla movement in our country. 99% of Colombians are against these insurgent groups. So I think all the different, relating with the countries with similar problems of Colombia, I think that they're very different at the end. In the case of Colombia, of this internal conflict, that we've been dealing with that conflict for the last 40 years, what happened is that in the last 10 years, we have a big change that was the drug money financing violence in Colombia. And that's why the equation changed completely. Now I think that the guerrilla movements, in the case of Colombia, one of them, the largest one, the FARC, used to be a Marxist-Leninist group. The ELN was a pro-Cuban movement. Now what they're doing, they're really getting into the business of drugs and trying to do is narco-terrorism instead of looking forward for a political scenario in our country. I think that one of the real experiences is that if you have really the political decision to do a peace process, you will do it. And I think that that's what the international community was doing in Colombia. For the first time in the history of our internal conflict, the international community was giving support to a country to trying to solve the problem. I think that it's not through a military solution that we're going to solve our problems. I think that it's through a political solution that we're going to solve our problems. What is happening in the case of Colombia with the FARC, that is the largest insurgent group, for 3 years I had conversations with them, but at the end what happened, in my perception, is that they break inside the FARC. The military side won over the political side. And that's why they never took the decision to go to the table of negotiation and to try to reach a peace agreement. And only in Colombia, I think that we will be back to the table of negotiations when the political side of the FARC will win over the military side. Knowing and showing that through conversations, through a table of negotiations, with the support of the international community, we will reach a peace process. But I think that it's only through a political solution, not through a military solution, that we're going to solve the problems. And I think the same thing is going to happen in other countries, as you were mentioned, that have similar problems, but different problems of the ones that we're having in our country.
What do you think of the difference between Bush and Clinton? Clinton pushed political solutions in North Korea. He was working with Khatami in the civilian government, in the elected government in Iran, moving towards negotiations with Syria. And we saw some progress with Libya, although it's murky a bit right now. We have a new president who's surrounded by neoconservatives who want to fight every country in the world. What do you think of the differences between those approaches?
How many times we have, Chris? Huh? No, I think that...
Do you think it's a smart look at things?
I think that one thing that happened in Colombia, and I think is very important, what President Clinton left as a legacy in the case of our country, that it's a bipartisan policy of the United States regarding Colombia. And I think that's very important for us because for the first time, we have the Democrats and Republicans working together in a country, supporting a country that has so many problems as Colombia. And I think that's the most important legacy. My ambassador to the United States here, and one of the things that when the U.S. Senate approved Plan Colombia, it was 98 votes approving Plan Colombia. I think it's not easy to have 98 votes to try to support a country in such difficulties as Colombia.
Who'd you lose?
I think,
Who'd you lose?
I think one senator was out of the session of the day, another was ill. So I think we had full support of the United States in this. But you know, Chris, this is very important because for the first time, after the change of government in the United States, still we have the support. We are going and fighting together this common enemy that is narco-trafficking. And I think that's very important for us, and we hope that we keep this support in the next years.
Next.
I'm Raj Venkatraman from the Wharton School of Business. The question is, what is your vision for Colombia's development? The reason I'm asking that is if you look at Asia and you talk about the oft-touted export-led development, and as you talk about your vision for the development, what I'm interested in knowing is what do you see as the trenchant problems in Colombia today? And as you move along the development path, how do you hope to avoid some of the dynamic issues such as preventing the wealth gap from becoming bigger and larger?
Yes, I think that the big challenge we have in Latin America now is how we move globalization really to give the poorest people in our continent answers to their problems, to avoid what you're saying, the gap between rich and poor. And I think that's the big challenge that we have now in Latin America. And one of the things that we have to do, I think, is through all this commercial integration, and I think that free trade agreement is going to be very important for us. In the case of my country, first of all, what we need is to grow. And I think we need to grow between 6 to 7% constantly for the next 5 or 10 years if we want really to close the gap between rich and poor. We have one problem, that is violence, this internal conflict. Colombia, regarding the figures of the International Development Bank, in the last 70 years, my country grew an average of 3.3%. Even that in the last 40 years, we have this internal conflict. And I think the internal conflict in Colombia is costing us 3 to 4 points every year. So if we have peace in Colombia, we should be growing an average to 6 or 7%. And that's why I've said that peace for us is the best business in Colombia. And that's why we need to try to reach a peace process in our country, because that's going to be the way of really closing the gap and bringing back Colombia to the right track of growth. Colombia this year is going to grow 2.53%. That is bad for us because we have a very high unemployment right now. We have between 16 to 70% of unemployment in Colombia. And we are going 2.5%. That is double or triple of what is going to happen in Latin America. But that's not good for us. And that's why we need to put all our efforts in all this process of commercial exchange between our countries. We want to strengthen the Indian community. That is very important for us. In the case of Venezuela, for example, is our second largest commercial partner. It's a $3 billion relationship with Venezuela. We need to strengthen the group of three, Colombia, Mexico, and Venezuela, because now Colombia should look through the Central American countries and to the Caribbean. That's our natural market. And we need to work very closely with all the Latin American countries to reach an agreement of the free trade agreement area at the end of 2005. But our challenge is how globalization will benefit the poor in our countries. Because one of the figures that we're looking is that if you see the income per capita of Latin America, I think it's the same or less of that we had 10 years ago. So we know that we have a problem there. And we need to invest in education, we need to invest in housing, we need to invest in health. And that's where we are, in the case of my country, getting all the resources to try to close this gap that is growing every year in the whole continent.
Next question.
Hi, I'm Jessica Bonda from Oxford. Kind of a quick corollary to that question, which is that there seems to be an intimate connection between violence and economic development. And I was wondering, what kind of reforms in the agricultural sector would you advocate that the world community to take on that might reduce the incentive of, say, farmers to actually get into drug development, in crop production?
I think more than measures inside Colombia is what, I don't know, was Bono yesterday or President Clinton saying, instead of aid, we need commerce. And that's what we are asking the world. Instead of giving us money, give us the possibility of commerce. Because it's really the way of getting resources. Because it's very difficult in the case of Colombia to look an alternative crop to coca or to poppy. Because it's very difficult to get a crop that is going to get such amount of resources for these people. We know that we have, or we could be competitive in many agricultural products. In the case of Colombia, we are very competitive, for example, in palm oil. And I think that one of the alternative development programs that we are promoting is palm oil in the northern part of Colombia, in which I think if the U.S. market is open for us, now we have the India trade preference for us that is going to be very important for my country. We could sell a lot of agricultural products to the United States. Reforestation is another product regarding the Kyoto Agreement. We could sell oxygen to the world. And that's something that we want to do in Colombia. Third of all, we've been doing a big agrarian reform. In my government, I have given to the peasants, to the black community, to the indigenous people in Colombia, 5 million hectares in agrarian reform. And I think that's something that is very important for my country. But on the other side, we have to invest also in infrastructure so that we could take out these products and put it in the international markets. Because what happened with the coca, or what happened with the heroin is that you take a package this big, you don't need roads to take this product out, and many times the drug traffickers go to your place to buy your product. So that's why we need also to invest in infrastructure, and that's what we're doing, because that's also a way of getting alternative crops earns high enough so that the peasants will go to an alternative crop.
We have just got the sign here to wrap up. I'm sorry we have to end the questions. I just want to end with a big wrap-up for you, ask you to do a wrap-up. Everybody thinks the world is a snapshot when in fact it's a dynamic. And we always live in the present, think the present is the past and the future. In the beginning of the 20th century, Argentina was the country to go. You would go off and marry a rich Argentine, because Argentina was ahead of us, ahead of North America, ahead of the United States. It was a richer country than the United States. People can't even get that in their head now. The United States has always been the richest country in the hemisphere. No, Argentina
You remember Argentina had subway in 1910.
It was ahead of us.
Yeah.
So it isn't always the same. Things change. I think Danny DeVito said in a Batman movie once, things change. And tell us now, crystal ball, the Americas, what's the structure going to be? What's it going to, if we took a trip through time right now to say 2050, what's the picture look like?
For us, I think that
in the whole North-South.
We will have strong democracies all around the continent, more active participation of the civil society in taking decisions in our country, and I think that's something that is opening every day. More participation of the civil society in the political decisions. Sometimes we're criticized, but for example in Colombia, we just had an election. There's going to be a new president inauguration on the 7th of August. Nobody thought that we were going to have elections. All the journalists were saying Colombia is in a civil war. Nobody's going to go to elections because we have problems of security. And you know, Chris, that in the last election, they could not vote in 5 municipalities. Of 20 million Colombians, 23 million Colombians that could go to the polls, only 23,000 could not vote. The return in the polls were more than 50%, more than the United States, and sometimes we're criticized because people are not acting or going in, very active into politics. I think that with a free trade agreement, the whole continent is going to be a new area for commerce that is going to be very important for us, open our borders, and I think that we, with this whole integration, commercial integration in our country, we will find a better quality for life for our people, and poverty, the gap between rich and poor, I think is going to be closer and closer and not opening, widening as is right now.
Thank you very much, President Andrés Pastrana. Thank you, sir.
It's that individuals will come forth at the risk of their own lives to save the life of the society. Andrés Pastrana Arango, the President of Colombia, is such an individual. His work for peace, order, and the betterment of the people reflects a generosity of the highest order. His Excellency, Andrés Pastrana Arango. Here to present the next award, Ralph Nader. Euripides wrote that there is no sorrow above the loss of one's native land.
El embajador ante el tribunal. Protocolo de la Cancillería de Colombia. Ministro de Agricultura. Secretario privado. Cristina trabajando en embajada ante las francesas. Coronel Chávez es mi jefe de seguridad. Mayor Remolina es mi director del Ejército de Colombia. Para dar mi jefe de prensa. Muchas gracias, Santidad, de verdad, por habernos recibido de nuevo. Les damos 2 libros, Santidades. Este es el libro de la expedición del maestro Musil, donde está toda la flora y la flora de la colonia, que es un libro muy especial, Santidad, que quería que lo tuviera. Y están todas las obras también del arte colombiano, de 3.500 años de historia también, para que lo tengan como recuerdo de Colombia. Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias. Sí, Armero ya, sobre lo que es Armero ya no se construyó nada, Santidad, sino se hizo 2 pueblos cercanos a Armero, pero Armero se dejó como Campo Santo, se mantiene como Campo Santo en el lugar donde usted estuvo, Santidad, donde la cruz, y se mantiene como Campo Santo, pero se reconstruyeron los 2, 3 municipios cerca de Armero.
Giornalisti colombiani, Andiamo.
Bueno, Santidad, de nuevo muchas gracias. Muchas gracias.
I'll put you in the middle there.
Okay, sit here.
Yeah. So when you in Moscow and Geneva, so I don't have a jet lag.
And when are you going to
I do tomorrow.
New York?
Where is Elizabeth? Again. Anyways, it's good to see you and all that. Let me thank you for your major contribution and all.
Hace más de 5 años, en la Cumbre Mundial sobre Alimentación de 1996, adquirimos el compromiso de reducir a la mitad el número de personas que padecen de hambre para el año 2015. Hoy nos volvemos a reunir y tenemos que reconocer que el avance ha sido poco significativo en la mayoría de los países en desarrollo. Vivimos ya el segundo año del siglo XXI y no hemos podido acercarnos con equidad a la meta mínima de justicia y compasión a que puede aspirar la humanidad, que sus integrantes tengan medios físicos de subsistencia y que no padezcan hambre. Son todavía más de 800 millones de hambrientos en el planeta. Millones de niños mueren cada año víctimas de desnutrición, no ante la mirada indolente del mundo, sino ante los ojos cerrados del mundo que prefieren no verlos para seguir viviendo sin cargos de conciencia. Este no es un problema político, no es un problema económico ni financiero. Aquí no se trata, apreciados amigos, de un problema de escasez de alimentos, porque el mundo produce suficiente alimentos para nutrir a todos sus habitantes. Lo que vivimos y sufrimos es un problema de humanidad que nos interpela y nos cuestiona como seres humanos con una misión en la vida. Como gobernante, como hombre que actuante en la vida pública de mi país y del mundo, siento vergüenza, y todos deberíamos sentirla, cuando pienso en miles de niños, de mujeres, ancianos y hombres que mueren cada día bajo el angustioso peso del hambre. Sé que la solución no está solo en mis manos o en la de ustedes, pero sí estamos obligados a denunciar, a actuar, a ser muy claros sobre las razones que nos han impedido avanzar aún más sobre la meta fijada en 1996. La gente no tiene hambre por falta de alimentos, sino por falta de oportunidades para adquirirlos. La gente tiene hambre porque la pobreza y el desempleo siguen agobiando los países que no formamos parte del pequeño grupo de naciones desarrolladas. La mitad de la población mundial vive con menos de $2 por día. La quinta parte vive con menos de $1 y padece las consecuencias de esta miseria infrahumana. hemos hablado de un desarrollo sostenible, hemos hablado de un medio ambiente sostenible. Ahora llegó la hora de hablar de una humanidad sostenible. Mientras subsistan las condiciones de pobreza en la inmensa mayoría del mundo, la humanidad como tal, y en ella incluyo a los países desarrollados, no es sostenible. Nadie puede ser rico si sus vecinos son pobres, decía el presidente Kennedy. Y yo agregaría, nadie puede sentirse alimentado si sus compañeros de humanidad, habiendo alimentos, tiene hambre. Podrá dar de comer a su cuerpo, pero su alma sufrirá de desnutrición por el resto de su vida. Aquí están representadas casi todas las naciones del planeta, pero hablo ahora por unas pocas privilegiadas. A ellas les digo, a los países en vía de desarrollo y sus habitantes no pedimos ayuda, no queremos alimentos regalados o brigadas humanitarias. Lo que queremos son oportunidades para crecer y para generar progreso y justicia social para nuestros pueblos. ¿Cómo es posible que los países más poderosos del mundo, con sus inmensos recursos, los destinen a subsidiar sus propios agricultores sin pensar que con ello generan una inmensa desventaja para los países de menor desarrollo que no pueden competir en esas condiciones? Es una visión miope y peligrosa pretender crecer a costa del perjuicio de los demás. Si los países ricos cierran sus mercados y utilizan sus políticas proteccionistas, ¿cómo vamos los demás a garantizar el empleo y la producción en los nuestros? Tarde o temprano deberán comprender que su mayor beneficio pasa por el beneficio de toda la humanidad en su conjunto. En lugar de crear subsidios, es necesario, como se discute en el seno de la OMC, desmontarlos gradualmente y entender que el comercio mundial no puede medirse con una misma regla a los países con diferentes niveles de ingreso. Para eliminar el hambre en el mundo se requiere primero luchar contra la pobreza, y para luchar contra la pobreza debemos procurar una distribución más justa de los recursos. Repito, este no es un problema político, sino de humanidad. Por supuesto, los países en desarrollo tenemos también un papel importante que jugar para la solución de nuestros propios problemas. Yo siento el dolor como presidente de Colombia de saber que más de la mitad de su población vive en la pobreza y que más del 10% se acuesta diariamente con una sola comida, muchas veces insuficiente. Los grupos terroristas al interior de mi país, financiados con el dinero del narcotráfico, son en gran parte causantes de esta miseria. Pero los gobernantes que obramos dentro de la democracia y de las vías pacíficas tenemos que liderar esfuerzos para aliviarla. En Colombia, los narcotraficantes han destruido cerca de 1 millón de hectáreas de bosques en la última década. También en la década del 90, con el impacto de una globalización cuyo costo pagamos los países de menores recursos, salieron de producción otro 1 millón de hectáreas y se dispararon las importaciones de alimentos y de materias primas. Durante los últimos 4 años hemos trabajado mucho por volver a revivir el campo con políticas novedosas como el apoyo a los encadenamientos productivos y a las alianzas estratégicas, así como estimulando la inversión rural e impulsando el desarrollo tecnológico. Y hemos obtenido buenos resultados. El área cultivada se ha incrementado en 400.000 hectáreas. La producción de alimentos subió en 2.8 millones de toneladas y el sector agropecuario crece nuevamente por encima del resto de la economía. Además, como un logro concreto, se redujo la tasa de mortalidad infantil, que en 1980 ascendía cerca del 50 por 1.000 nacidos vivos a un 21.5 por 1.000 en el año 2000, por debajo del promedio de América Latina. Por estos resultados son frágiles y están siendo atacados por la obra de los terroristas, financiados, reitero, con el dinero de las drogas ilícitas, que es un flagelo mundial y no solo colombiano. Por eso es fundamental que el mundo apoye el proceso de sustitución de cultivos, dándole acceso preferencial a los productos derivados de los programas de desarrollo alternativo. El convenio que firmamos con la FAO en noviembre del año pasado para trabajar sobre este y otros temas será sin duda de inmensa importancia para recuperar no solo el desarrollo rural, sino la paz en mi país. Pero no podemos solos. Colombia no puede sola contra el negocio multinacional de las drogas ilícitas y tampoco podemos solo los países en desarrollo contra el hambre de nuestros pueblos, en tanto los países desarrollados no adquieran una conciencia global y entiendan que el hambre en África, que el hambre en Asia, El hambre en América Latina es también un problema que les concierne directamente. Una sociedad que no privilegia a los más débiles está condenada al caos, decía la Madre Teresa de Calcuta. Hoy concluyo ante ustedes con un pensamiento similar. Un mundo indiferente ante el hambre de sus habitantes está condenado al hambre para siempre. Muchas gracias.
Señor presidente Andrés Pastrana acaba de terminar una visita de 48 horas con una agenda muy intensa en Roma. ¿Cuál es el balance de esta visita aquí en Italia?
Bueno, creo que muy importante. Tuvimos oportunidad de primero venir a la FAO, a la Cumbre de Alimentos, hacer un balance de cómo y de qué forma podemos combatir el hambre en el mundo. Hay una crítica en que los países que nos pusimos la meta en rebajar la mitad en el 2015 la crisis de alimentos en el mundo no se viene cumpliendo. Y por lo tanto llamar la atención a los países desarrollados que todos tenemos que aportar. Como digo yo, aquí no es falta de alimentos, sino falta de decisión política, y por eso esperamos que exista más decisión política, especialmente en los países desarrollados. En segunda instancia, tuve oportunidad también de estar con el Santo Padre, intercambiar opiniones frente al proceso de paz, agradecerle la ayuda que tanto el Santo Padre como el nuncio en Colombia le dieron durante estos 4 años a los procesos de paz, que de una u otra forma comenzamos nosotros y que desafortunadamente por decisión de la guerrilla no se llevaron a cabo, pero el Vaticano siempre estuvo atento. Inclusive yo le mencionaba ayer al Santo Padre que en más de 14 oportunidades el Santo Padre se refirió al tema de la paz en Colombia durante mi gobierno. Igualmente tuvimos oportunidad de hablar con el Secretario General de las Naciones Unidas sobre este tema, sobre cómo y de qué forma puede las Naciones Unidas continuar vinculado, como hasta ahora ha estado vinculado al proceso de paz en el país, y intercambiar opiniones también en qué estado se encuentra el proceso, cómo y de qué forma podemos avanzar, y bueno, ya será una decisión también de los grupos insurgentes.
Usted insiste en la corresponsabilidad para definir temas como el hambre, como definir temas como la pobreza, inclusive el mismo la lucha contra el narcotráfico y terrorismo.
Sí, porque nosotros no podemos solos, y es lo que hemos reiterado. Colombia no puede solo, estamos combatiendo a un enemigo común de la humanidad como es el narcotráfico, y hoy en día el narcoterrorismo. Es el narcotráfico el gran financiador de la violencia. Y por eso la importancia, inclusive en el programa que ya nosotros hemos firmado con la FAO, hay 2 o 3 elementos que son muy importantes. Primero, cómo y de qué forma podemos generar un plan de seguridad alimenticia en nuestro país. En segunda instancia, cómo y de qué forma podemos también desarrollar programas para la protección del medio ambiente, programas que tienen que ver también con la reforma agraria y programas con la FAO también que tienen que ver con la sustitución de cultivos. Entonces yo creo que aquí hay ya hechos muy importantes, que son programas que ya hemos firmado con la FAO y que esperamos que puedan continuarse hacia adelante.
Se ha demostrado por parte de la comunidad internacional un compromiso para enfrentar el terrorismo, pero también se habla de la necesidad de que grupos terroristas sean incluidos en la lista. En el caso de las FARC, que se anuncia una próxima inclusión en la lista de terroristas de la Unión Europea.
Sí, eso esperamos. Esa fue buena parte de nuestra gestión que hicimos en la cumbre de Madrid, en la cumbre entre América Latina y la Unión Europea, y nosotros esperamos que quienes hacen terrorismo, quienes desarrollan actos terroristas, pues sean incluidos en las listas de terroristas de los respectivos países.
Y finalmente, señor presidente, a los últimos días ya de su mandato de estos 4 años, ¿usted considera que sí estuvo bien habérsela jugado por la paz?
Definitivamente. La paz es el camino, como decía Gandhi. Tenemos que seguir buscando una solución política al conflicto. En el caso mío, pues hemos fortalecido nuestras Fuerzas Armadas también para defender a los colombianos, como nunca antes en la historia de Colombia, pero yo sigo convencido y sigo creyendo que es la solución política, la solución precisamente al conflicto interno que estamos viviendo los colombianos.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Listo. El canciller de Guatemala.
Embajador. Excelentísimo señor presidente y excelentísima señora primera dama, eminencia reverendísima, excelencias reverendísimas, excelencias, señoras y señores. El nombre de Colombia nos recuerda en un modo particular el profundo vínculo que la une históricamente a Cristóbal Colombo, aquel hombre que quiso cruzar el inmenso e ignoto Atlántico y que con extraordinario coraje y heroica tenacidad afrontó todos los peligros, seguro de arribar a aquella maravillosa y hasta entonces desconocida tierra. Confiaba su propio destino y el de sus hombres a la destreza de luchar las tempestades oceánicas, orientando sabiamente las velas hacia que el viento impetuoso, en lugar de derribar las 3 embarcaciones, las empujara hacia el puerto deseado. La confianza de aquellos hombres fuertes no decae nunca, porque sobre las velas de sus naves estaba impreso el símbolo del Santísimo Salvador, aquella cruz bendita que había sido señalada como signo de victoria segura. Ardua y difícil aquella empresa que Colombo y los suyos lograron, dando así inicio a un proceso histórico complejo, en el cual comenzó a predominar la fuerza del Evangelio. En aquellas tierras apenas conocidas por la gente de Europa, las nuevas ciudades que se construían llevaban en sus nombres su origen cristiano, y con Cristo, el cual es la misma sapiencia Dei, asumen valor de principio fundamental los estudios para la búsqueda de la verdad. Así, en Santa Fe de Bogotá, en 1580, surge por iniciativa de los dominicanos la Universidad de Santo Tomás. En 1604, la Compañía de Jesús abre aquel colegio donde estudiará también San Pedro Claver, el cual en 1621 se convierte en la Universidad Javeriana. Pocas personas saben que el 1 de abril de 1636 se iniciaron en la Universidad Javeriana las lecciones de medicina, que fueron las primeras lecciones dictadas en toda América. En 1653, el arzobispo de Santa Fe de Bogotá funda el Colegio Mayor de Nuestra Señora de Rosario, que se convertirá después en la Universidad del Rosario. Y en 1708, por iniciativa franciscana, fue fundada la Universidad de San Buenaventura. Esta bella florescencia de instituciones de alta cultura que acompañaba el camino paciente de la civilización cristiana fue violenta y mortalmente menospreciada por las fuertes persecuciones anticatólicas del liberalismo del 800. Hoy, por lo demás, se confunde la ideología liberal con los ideales democráticos, que en verdad eran posiciones antitéticas de pensamiento. El liberalismo reclamaba toda libertad para los hombres libres, no para los pobres, o ninguno se escandalice, para los esclavos, de quienes en Norteamérica eran legalmente los propietarios, unos constituyentes. No sabemos cuál habría sido el desarrollo de la sociedad colombiana sin aquel brusco cambio de dirección. Pero sabemos que la antigua universidad tomista fue restablecida solo en 1965, durante el gobierno del presidente Guillermo León Valencia, después de 104 largos años. Excelentísimo señor presidente, en este momento solemne en el cual, como expresión de la más alta estimación y del profundo afecto por su persona y por el Estado por usted dignamente representado, le conferimos el gran collar de la orden que honra el nombre del Santísimo Salvador, porque la fundación fue inspirada por él a Santa Brigida de Suecia. Viene espontáneo repetirle las palabras que el mismo Cristo dijo al gran Constantino, la tarde que cambió el curso de la historia, en toto nica. Este es el signo de la victoria. A usted, como estadista que ha guiado su país en el tercer milenio cristiano, tan fuertemente comprometido en construir un futuro mejor para la querida Colombia, sus nuevos hermanos y hermanas de la orden brigidiana de muchos lugares del mundo se unen a mí para augurarle que el gran pueblo colombiano despliegue aquellas velas calmadas, libres, sin miedo, aquellas velas que todavía llevan el signo de la ligadas, para que se lancen a la reconquista de los perennes valores del cristianismo. Seguros de vencer, porque será la potencia del soplo del Espíritu a conducirlos hacia la llegada de una nueva civilización, de la concordia, de la solidaridad, de la verdadera libertad y la búsqueda del bien común. Dios lo bendiga a usted, a su familia, al gran pueblo de la querida República de Colombia. Gracias. Prima qualche fotografia. Mettiamo anche il mantello. Il padrino.
El padrino, muy bien.
El embajador Pablo. Una benedizione por parte del
Benedict Dominos ec indumenta ad honorum nominis tui ed auxilium hominum qui eum portabunt in nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti.
Amen. Hay también el pergamino que oficializa su nombramiento.
Muchas gracias.
Muy bonito.
obispos que nos acompañan, querido amigo señor vicepresidente de la hermana República de Guatemala, señor canciller, señores embajadores, señor Guillermo León Escobar, embajador de Colombia ante la Santa Sede, doctor Fabio Valencia, embajador de Colombia ante el Quirinal y la FAO, y señora, queridos miembros de la comitiva que nos acompañan, queridas amigas y amigos, Nora. Quiero agradecerle a usted como príncipe gran maestre de la Orden Militar del Santísimo Salvador y Santa Brígida de Suecia, por el nombramiento que con el Supremo Consejo de la Orden me ha hecho como miembro de ella y por la entrega del gran collar reservado a los jefes de estados que, profesando los principios del Evangelio y viviendo en armonía con la fe católica, tratan de ser líderes y constructores de una nueva sociedad, humanizando cada vez más un mundo que requiere de solidaridad y de justicia social, que son las bases reales de la conciencia para quienes como hijos de Dios debemos vivir la plenitud de la dignidad de la persona humana. Más de 700 años constituyen el testimonio de nuestra orden, fundada como la única constructora pacífica de la paz. La sabiduría del espíritu fundador lo hizo crecer con la certeza de que la violencia no construye, de que el terrorismo carcome el espíritu, de que la muerte es el irrespeto mayor para quienes indefensos anhelan cumplir la visión que los convoca a la alegría de vivir. Como presidente de la República de Colombia, he hecho todo lo posible para fundar la paz. He ido aún más allá de lo que en el quehacer político tradicional se podría llegar. He invertido en la paz todo el prestigio acumulado a lo largo de mi vida pública y lo he hecho con desinterés, a sabiendas de conocer exactamente que mi verdad era tan solo la de sembrar lo que las generaciones siguientes habrán de cosechar. Es por ello que este gran collar lo recibo desde el espíritu de paz de la Orden como un gran homenaje a la paz de Colombia y a quienes me han ayudado a construirla y a los que de una manera u otra se han sacrificado por ella. Y quiero, bajo el amparo de este honor que Su Alteza me concede, decir aquí en Roma que el presidente de la República de Colombia es un defensor y promotor incondicional de la vida, de la familia, de la equidad social, de la búsqueda de los recursos para crear puentes de supervivencia para los pobres, del incansable trabajar por satisfacer las necesidades de las gentes más humildes y sobre todo buscarle futuro a los valores de una cristianidad anhelante de porvenir. Al agradecerle a Su Alteza el Gran Consejo de la Orden y a todos los que aquí solidariamente me acompañan, quiero ratificar que participo de esa verdad irrebatible de que cada quien recoge de la paz lo que ha colocado en ella. Yo miro con optimismo el porvenir, porque sé que quienes deben continuar la tarea no tienen otra alternativa que profesar el mismo principio, que ha dado razón a todos nuestros desvelos, y es el de que el derecho a la paz es el principio fundante de la moderna democracia. Desde esa convicción los saludo a usted y los invito a intensificar conmigo el amor a una patria que todo lo merece. Muchas gracias. Bueno, presidente, muchas gracias. Buenos días.